The U.S. Navy has seized two Venezuela-linked oil tankers. The first, sailing under a Russian flag, was boarded in the North Atlantic. The ship is accused of breaking U.S. sanctions and, historically, transporting Venezuelan crude oil. Russia reportedly sent a submarine and Navy ships to guard the now empty oil tanker. The Bella has been renamed the Marinera. U.S. forces tried to board it near Venezuela last month. The tanker was last tracked in the Atlantic Ocean off the southern coast of Iceland. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the blockade of sanctioned and illicit Venezuelan oil remains in full effect anywhere in the world. The U.S. has also confirmed it's captured a second Venezuela-linked tanker in international waters in the Caribbean Sea. In a post on X, U.S. Southern Command said, in a pre-dawn action on Wednesday morning, the Department of War apprehended a stateless, sanctioned dark fleet motor tanker without incident. The indicted vessel, the MT Sophia, was operating in international waters and conducting illicit activities in the Caribbean Sea. We will defend our homeland and restore security and strength across the Americas. Al Jazeera's Dmitry Medvedenko is in Moscow to talk about this in further detail. But let's first go to Kimberly Halkett. She's at the White House in Washington, D.C. Good to see you, Kimberly. So an extraordinary transatlantic game of cat and mouse appears, we understand, to be over with reports of the tanker's interception in the North Atlantic. What are you learning about this weeks-long operation and why the pursuit began in the first place?
Well, the pursuit began because the United States has announced and has been enforcing for weeks now an oil blockade of oil, what it calls illicit oil, coming to and from Venezuela, that it alleges funds narco-terrorism, but also that it is some support of nations like and activities such as Iran. And so as a result, the U.S. Department of Justice has put out warrants and has also put in place sanctions that the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem says have now been enforced, in which she calls to meticulously executed pre-dawn operations to seize the what she's calling shadow fleets. In other words, that these vessels were either departing from Venezuela with what the U.S. officials call illicit oil or heading to Venezuela. One was, as you mentioned, seized in the North Atlantic, the other in the Caribbean. And as you mentioned, there has been a bit of a cat and mouse game with the U.S. Coast Guard pursuing at least one of the vessels for several weeks. Now, in the midst of all this, I can tell you on Capitol Hill, there is a briefing underway with the Defense Secretary or Department of War Secretary, as well as the Secretary of State and also the Director of the CIA, among others. What they are doing is briefing senior senators on the next steps for Venezuela, given that surprise operation that occurred over the weekend and resulted in the ouster of the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who now is sitting in a jail in New York State. So there have been so many fast-moving developments, not just in the last hour or so, but in the last few days. Many senators asking what the end state is, what the goal is, and why they weren't informed about all of these operations in advance.
Kimberly, thanks for that. Kimberly Halkett at the White House. Let's go to Dmitry Medvedenko in Moscow. And Dmitry, you've been monitoring developments around this oil tanker pursued by the US. We now understand it's been boarded, despite reports it was being protected by a Russian sub, potentially also a ship. I understand there's been some reaction in Moscow.
That is correct. Reaction came from the Transport Ministry of Russia, which is surprising that it's not from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Kremlin, given the magnitude of the situation. The Transport Ministry has explained some of the things and given some context. It says, on December 24th, 2025, the vessel Marinera received temporary permission to sail under a Russian flag, issued on the basis of Russian registration and international law. The statement from the Transport Ministry then goes on to say that today it lost contact with the vessel after it was boarded by U.S. naval forces. And then comes this paragraph, I'm going to read it to you. In accordance with the provisions of the 1982 UN Convention of the Law of Sea, freedom of navigation applies in the open sea, and no state has the right to use force against vessels duly registered in the jurisdictions of other states. Now, if this was, let's say, reservedly worded, the foreign ministry just reposted this text and said nothing else on top of it. We had expected some kind of bigger reaction, given that there were reports in US media that Russia allegedly sent a submarine and some Navy vessels to support this tanker. And we didn't see any evidence of any kind of, confrontation with US forces in open sea. And now there's barely any confrontation on the diplomatic side of things.
All right, Dmitry, many thanks for that. Dmitry Medvedenko in Moscow, and earlier, of course, Kimberly Halcon of the White House.
Don't miss out. Get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news, expert insight. Like, share, stay ahead.